What if the stories we bury are the very keys to our healing? Welcome to Inner Peace, Better Health. I'm your host, Shreya. Today's guest, Dr. Liz DeBetta, invites us into the raw, redemptive space where creativity becomes medicine. A scholar, artist, activist, and narrative healer, Liz unearths how embodied storytelling can reclaim identity, disrupt inherited trauma, and move us from survival to soulful expression. This conversation isn't just about art, it's about liberation. Welcome, Liz, and I'm honored to have you on my show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be here.
Okay, so I'm starting the questions. So, my very first question is, Liz, how did creativity become a lifeline in your trauma healing journey?
Yeah, creativity has always been a lifeline. So I'll go back to when it kind of started. And I'll tell you that story. So when I was 14, I was an emotional wreck all the time. And everybody just assumed it was because I was a girl, I was a teenager, that was just normal. But it didn't feel normal for me. It didn't feel good to constantly have these emotions that felt so big and overwhelming and that were always threatening to overflow, and they frequently did in really weird and uncomfortable ways, like in the middle of class for no reason, because we were reading a story that made me emotionally respond, and I would have to like get up and leave because I couldn't stop crying. And so at the time I had a really smart teacher and coach who recognized that I was having these really overwhelming emotions and suggested that I start writing. And of course, I thought that was the stupidest idea that I had ever heard, because I was 14 and I thought, I'm not going to write poetry. What do you mean, write poetry? And then I kind of had a little bit of a paradigm shift around it, because he shared a poem of his with me. And it really struck me that the vulnerability of this man, I also had some very gendered ideas about uh, things at the time. And so it struck me that if he could be vulnerable in this way and he could use poetry to express what he was feeling, then maybe it wasn't such a dumb idea. So I got a little notebook and I started writing really secret poems. Like, I never shared them with anybody. And it was around the same time that I also got involved in community theater, because I always wanted to be an actor. I loved being on stage. I had been doing school plays since I was in elementary school. And doing community theater was another way for me to put my intense emotions somewhere. It was also a way for me to live someone else's life for a while and not feel so confused about my own, because as an adopted person, I didn't know anything about my biological family or my ethnic background or any of my medical history and all of those things. And so, but nobody was talking to me about that. And that's where my intent, that's years later, I learned that all of those huge, overwhelming emotions were my unprocessed grief and my unhealed trauma. And so being able to write and perform at that critical stage of development when I was a teenager, those two things really helped me to stay afloat, right? And I say this all the time to people, that I don't think I would still be here if I didn't have those two outlets. And those are things that have served me well my entire life.
Yeah, I think it's great that you have channeled it out and you have got that person in your life, and now you're here and you're sharing your story to us also and to listeners who will be also inspired by it. So, was there a moment when you realized your story wasn't just personal, it's universal?
Yeah. So fast forward a bunch of years, right? And I was in my late 30s, And I had hit another sort of critical point in my life where I realized that I wasn't okay, and that all of the tools that I had been using, i.e., the writing and the performing, and, I was also a runner and, very physically active. All these things were no longer helpful to me. And I had to figure out what was going on that made me feel so stuck in my life. And that also was contributing to some really unhealthy patterns that I noticed that I had. And it was at this same time that I was invited to write about being adopted. And I didn't think that I had a story to tell because I didn't have any information. I didn't have any access to any records. I didn't know who my first mom or my first family was. I knew very, very little because the secrecy and around closed records. And I was taking a class at the time in autobiographical writing and creative nonfiction. And my professor was like, just think about it. Just, like this might be the story you need to tell. And I struggled. I really struggled through figuring out how to tell that story. But in the act of that struggle, I realized that I did have a story and that it was a story that mattered to more than just me, because when I shared it with my class and, worked through all the various drafts of it to get it from a story that wasn't mine to a story that was, there was a lot of shift that happened in other people because they started to realize the impact of adoption on people. And then about 6 months later, I submitted it for a personal narrative, a writing for social change conference, and I won an award for best personal narrative. And I got to read it publicly, and I realized that this was a story that had meaning not just for me but for other people. And then that sort of kicked off this whole chain of events, and which got me to where I am now and the work that I do now.
That's very powerful. And it's truly need courage to come up with your own story and sharing that. So you describe storytelling as a form of resistance. In what ways can reclaiming your or our narrative challenge systems of oppression?
Yeah, this is a big one for me because, again, as an adopted person, I have lived with stories that were handed to me, right? Narratives that are made up by culture and society about why my first mother gave me up, why I was adopted, why I was put into my family. And those were not my stories. Those are stories that I had internalized and had to work through unraveling to figure out what my story was. And so when I started writing my own stories and figuring out what my own story was, I realized that this was a way to reclaim a different narrative about what it feels like to be adopted and what it means to be adopted, which pushes back against those dominant cultural narratives, which are very much about painting adoptive parents as heroes and saviors, about villainizing first mothers as irresponsible or promiscuous or unfit mothers, and makes adoptees the object in the story, because then we're supposed to be grateful, right? And so for me, and those are narratives that are oppressive, right? Because they're rooted in patriarchal thinking, and they're rooted in that system of oppression, which says that some people are more fit to be parents than others, and is like that two parents are better than one, and that people with more financial privilege, typically white people with more financial privilege, are are better parents. And so for me, being able to tell a story about what the internal of experience of being adopted was like for the you know first 40 years of my life was tremendously empowering. And it was my way of starting to push back against those systems of oppression, because many of us are conditioned to stay silent about these things, especially when we're talking about trauma, right? And one of the things that never gets talked about in the culture of adoption is that it is always trauma. Maternal separation is a significant life trauma, and it doesn't go away. It is a lifelong experience. And so being able to tell truthful stories about that and find language to attach to that internal experience pushes back against all of those narratives that have served to oppress a lot of people. And for me, like, I have some privilege in being able to tell my own story, and so the sort of companion to that is that there are some other adopted people who, for many reasons, can't tell their own stories, but they see themselves in my story and they feel less alone.
Yeah, I think it's I have no words to say because uh, as somebody who is not adopted, or I luckily maybe I haven't gone through that phase, but we always have heard the story that society has told us. But here I am listening to something that you have gone through, that the true story, and it's really uh good for the generation and for the society also to know the real story, because otherwise it's just one story that the society is keep telling us. And yeah, that's great. So how do you protect your truth when institutions try to silence it?
That's that's a really great question. I mean, and that's the thing, right?
Yeah.
That's the whole task here, is to continue to speak truth to power, because there are a lot of institutions that want to silence adoptee voices, and, by extension, women's voices, and it's a place, again, where I can use my privilege, because in some ways, while my identity is marginalized, there are also parts of my identity as a middle-aged white woman in the United States that I am protected, and that there's going to be a little bit less pushback against the stories that I'm telling than some other people, and I'm very aware of that. But it just, for me, it's deciding what parts of my story to tell, right? And so protecting my truth is about continuing to say the things that need to be said, and also honoring the people in my story whose stories are different, right? And so I'm always careful to tell my story, and keep it's central to my experience.
And really thanks to you that you have used your privileges in a good way to help others, and not in a, I mean, the way usually people does. So really thanks to you. And your work blends embodiment with writing. So what does it look like to write from the body rather than just about it?
Yeah. So I think, for me, there was sort of a progression, because I did a lot of writing about my body for a while. And I realized that it was because I was so disconnected from my body because of all the trauma, right?
Yeah.
Um, People who have histories of trauma are often very disembodied, but also disembodiment is a function of white supremacy. It's the culture that tells us that we should disconnect ourselves from our emotions and our bodies, and just kind of, I think of it as like operating as like floating heads, right? Like, we're just operating in our brains and disconnected from what's going on in our bodies. And I realized, as I was, started reading through some of my earlier writings, that I had, sort of preoccupation with bodies and my body. And I was also, in doing my PhD, and got really interested in embodiment, and like what that could do as a tool for healing, and also a lot of good therapy. And where I learned because I felt very unsafe in my own body, but as a woman, firstly, That's the reality. And as an adopted person, like my body has always felt unsafe because
Mm.
I didn't understand what my feelings were and what they were attached to. And so I um became really preoccupied with this concept of embodied storytelling and becoming more embodied and being aware so that I could reconnect with myself. And a lot of that happened when I wrote, when I was writing and then rehearsing and then eventually performing my award-winning solo show Unmothered, which was my experiment with this concept of embodied storytelling as a tool for healing, where I got to tell the story that was mine in a very embodied way. And in the process, really pay attention to what was happening in my body and what I was feeling and why and what parts of my story it was connected to. And so when I talk about writing from the body, it's about an embodied experience of feeling where the stories are and then letting them come out a natural and an organic way without thinking too much. And so we, in my Migrating Toward Wholeness programs, we do specific kinds of writing, both free writing and acrostic poem writing, which engage different parts of the brain and help us tap into more of an embodied experience rather than a intellectual experience.
That's so beautifully said. And I have another question in my mind that what do you say to someone who feels that they are not creative enough to tell their story or writing to heal?
Mhm. I get that all the time because people are always like, "Oh, but I'm not a writer. I'm not, you don't need this isn't about being a writer. It's not about how you write. It's about what you write." And so that's why the embodied writing is really important, and the process of disconnecting from the critical mind using free writing. I talk about the free writing aspect of the work as a radical act of self-acceptance because it allows us to tap into feelings and emotions that we can't get at in other more traditional forms of writing. And it unlocks some creativity, and people get surprised all of the time. It's about giving ourselves permission, right?
Yeah,
I call it in the Migrating Toward Wholeness process, it's about making space to heal and rewriting the truth, expressing whatever the core or primal wound is so that we can become the subject of our own stories and break all of those silences that we've held on to. And so it's just letting people know that they don't have to, we're all creative people. We just unlearn that as we get older.
yeah. I think we all have certain kind of like trauma or experience that we need to share. Like if I talk about myself, in my childhood, I had a stammering problem, so it was very hard for me to speak. Uh, and I got bullied in my school, in my tuitions, in my coaching, and with my relatives, and all all of this. And now I am a podcast host, so I have worked in that, but I've never got the courage, maybe, or I've never thought of coming to a platform and telling my story. But now, listening to you, I think that I also should share my story. That if someone is having this problem, if I can do something about them, that will be really great. So thanks for doing that also.
Yeah. I mean, and that's the whole thing, right? I mean, one of the things I love to say all the time is that more stories equal more connection and more connection equals more healing. And you don't know who's going to be affected when you tell your story. And that's why it's important to tell our stories, because there might be somebody listening who says, "Oh, wow, okay, me too. And now I feel less alone. And I feel like if this person is here and has made it this far, I'm going to be okay too."
Yeah, yeah, that's so true. Uh, so how do I invite people past the inner critic and into creative courage?
Yeah. So for adopted people in particular, there's a big inner critic where we're always, because we're hyper vigilant, because one of the ways that trauma expresses itself is in constantly being on the lookout for danger. And it's that sort of like, I'm always like paying attention to what's happening across the room and who's talking over there and what is happening outside on the street. And that's a lot of noise. And part of that noise is the inner critic and women, like women are notorious for having like deep inner critics, and it can be the voice of, like some teacher at some point who told us we weren't good at something, or, a parent or a caregiver who criticized, and that like that we internalize that. And so the best way to get over that was to find something that brings you joy and just start doing it for the sake of doing it. It doesn't have to be good. It just has to be for you, right? And for people that I work with in my writing groups, the way we get over that inner critic is we engage in these types of writing that are self-reflective and free writing and acrostic poetry that helps us to, excuse me, that helps us to bypass that part of our brains, right? And it takes practice.
Yeah, definitely. Practice makes us perfect. So another question come to my mind, that as someone deeply rooted in social justice, how do you ensure your work holds space for collective liberation and not just individual growth?
Yeah. Thank you for this question. I'm always deeply concerned about my community, and I do a lot of my storytelling in very public ways that brings other people in, so that it's not just about me, but it's about the adoptee community at large. And I have a lot of collaborative projects going on with people in the adoption community, so that our voices become a critical mass instead of just single voices. It stopped being about my own individual healing a long time ago. And my work is so deeply rooted in helping other people heal, and creating and holding space for them to do that through the Migrating Toward Wholeness process, and through performing my show Unmothered, and creating spaces for them to process through what their stories are and what their feelings are, and supporting people to tell their own stories so that we're getting more of our stories out in the world, but also taking up the space that I can with the privilege that I do have, so that it gives other people the encouragement to be able to do the same. And then we become a collective voice for liberating ourselves from all of these narratives that have kept us silent and have harmed us for a long time.
Yeah, that's so true. Um, and how can we, as listeners or as storytellers, become a part of that narrative justice movement?
I love that question. And I love this idea of a narrative justice movement. I hadn't thought about it in quite those terms, but that's what it is, narrative
Yeah,
justice. Yeah, I think it's taking up space and doing, breaking silences, right? Which
yeah,
I've said is a core aspect of the Migrating Toward Wholeness process. But so many of us have silences that we can break. And when we start to break those silences, that around the stories that we've either been unable to tell or afraid to tell or conditioned not to speak about, we start to create space for empathy. And we need so much more empathy in the world. And when we start to build that sort of chain reaction of empathy, when other people hear our stories and our inner truths, that's for me what narrative justice is, by creating space for all of the stories, not just the ones that are sugar coated and, the unicorns and rainbows, if you will,
yeah,
but all, the full spectrum of the human experience, because we all have stories to tell, and some of them are not good stories, but they need to be heard.
yeah. And I hope that after this podcast releases, our listeners will also come up with their stories, and we will make a great chain and a beautiful community where we will listen to their
Mhm.
truths, and people can get inspired and can share their stories too. That's
Yeah.
I hope so. So, if our listeners want to connect with you, what is the best way?
The best way is to go to my website, lizdebetta.com, and join my mailing list. And you can also contact me directly through the website. And if you just Google my name, I will come up and I'm very easy to find. And you can also find me on social media at dr.lizdebetta.
So, I'll make sure to attach all the links and all the details below so that our listeners can come up and find that very easily. So, yeah, I think it's a great conversation and it's really great to have you on my show. And the podcast will be very helpful for our listeners too. So, for today, our listeners, today's conversation was just a reminder that your story holds sacred power, whether whispered in a journal or maybe shouted on a stage. Every word can become a thread back to wholeness. So take a breath, take a pen, and take your story back. Until next time, keep seeking inner peace and better health. Thank you.